for having BigID and myself here tonight. My name is Dimitri Sirota. I'm the CEO of BigID. My partner, Nimrod, is here live videoing this Facebook video. So just a little bit about us before I get started on the company and the problem we're addressing. We're a relatively new company. We raised a couple $1 million earlier this year. Both myself and my partner have long histories in the identity space. He was most recently head of identity products at CA after kind of a 15-year career, starting off in engineering and moving up through various technology roles and then product roles. Myself, I came in more through the entrepreneurial bent. So I've had several security companies. My last one I sold a couple of years back to CA Technologies after growing it to about 200 people. And so we got started on this project kind of late last year, raised our money. One of our investors is here somewhere in the audience. And we raised a few million to basically solve what we consider, and what I think hopefully you will consider or realize is a big problem, which is really the problem around protecting identity data, which oftentimes gets associated with privacy. And believe it or not, it's a little bit of an unaddressed part of security. So oftentimes in security, you deal with things like encryptions or controls like deletion, tokenization, things that basically allow you to block or interdict information or at least make it obscure. Or alternatively, you deal with the detection of a particular event, an insider, an outsider coming in. However, there's a whole host of concerns in around the actual privacy of customer or employee information that today is largely unaddressed. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So we kind of play into two large problems. So one, and you've seen a version of the slide in the last presentation, is all about kind of breaches and the fact that clearly there's this propensity for hackers and nation-state actors to steal identity data. That's become the majority of what gets stolen from an organization. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of companies in the Bay Area, some here in New York, many in Israel, that are tackling the problem of detecting people coming in and also blocking or interdicting. However, there's a lot still to be done around prevention and then after the fact remediation. And so if you think about what BigID is working on from a privacy standpoint, we really help organizations to get smart about their customer information so that they can take preventative steps, be they encryption, be they tokenization, be they deletion. Secondly, we also help them become more intelligent about what data is out there so that in the event of an occurrence like a breach, they can notify the right people. They can figure out who was impacted, things of that sort. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. Now, the second issue that we speak to, and this is one that usually technology companies, frankly, don't talk about, which is the problem of privacy and regulations around privacy. So if you go back maybe 2 years, nobody cared about this. The penalties for doing nothing were insignificant. That's changed. Some of you may be aware Privacy Shield was just passed in the EU yesterday, which is the replacement for Safe Harbor, which basically regulated how information was allowed to flow between the EU and the US. Big penalties. On top of that, in April, the EU passed the General Data Protection Regulation, which basically stipulated a whole host of requirements around what you have to do with customer or citizen data, also employee data, which today really isn't addressed. And the penalties for doing nothing when this law takes effect in less than 2 years could be 4% of your global revenue. And you don't have to be headquartered in Holland for this to affect you. You just have to have one customer in Europe. But it's not just Europe. You're seeing laws around privacy passed around the world. And even here in the US, we've had multiple presentations to the Federal Trade Commission, which used to be the primary regulator of privacy. The FCC, so Tom Wheeler, the commissioner, very recently said that he wants to take responsibility for privacy among broadband providers. You've seen the Attorney General, you've seen the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They've all become a lot more vigilant around privacy, and even the president has recently passed 2 executive orders in around privacy. So this is becoming a bigger deal, and again, corporations are ill-equipped to address this. So let's talk about kind of what's missing. And very kind of colloquially, what's missing is a LifeLock for the enterprise. So if you want to kind of think about what we're doing in the very kind of broad sense, we're helping organizations basically get smart and monitor their customer or employee data so they can take better preventative precautions to protect it and deal with some of the privacy. Now, typically when we talk about kind of protection and privacy of personal data, we talk about kind of four things. We talk about understanding where that data is. And the primary reason is because you can't protect what you don't know about. Now, the problem here is the tools to deal with discovery are all about 15 years old, and they don't actually address a lot of the requirements from the new privacy regulations. They don't tell you what data belongs to Dimitri Sirota. Well, that's the law, because I'm allowed to access my information. If I want to be forgotten, you have to forget about me. In the event of a breach, you only have 3 days to basically notify me, or again, you can be penalized 4%. So there's a lot to be done on the discovery side. On the data mapping side, I talked about Privacy Shield. Well, that's an example of understanding where the data goes. So that's obviously an international example, but that also matters within a company. You want to know what applications are touching what databases. You want to know what data you're sharing with the cloud or with partners. You want to know what data is passing between the UK and the EU. So all that is a data mapping exercise. And you know the way this is done today? It's done through interviews. It's done through questionnaires and surveys. It's done in the same way the Romans or the ancient Greeks would have done it. There really isn't any technology. So obviously this is an area that is ripe for automation. Risk. So what we talk about there is really helping organizations understand the vulnerability of their data. And this comes back to that kind of prevention. So obviously, if you know somebody, or if you take vitamins, if you go to the doctor on a regular basis, if you exercise, you're going to prevent the occurrence of disease. In a similar way, if you understand how your data is being accessed, where your data is it encrypted, not encrypted, you can take better precautions to, for instance, secure highly sensitive data that may be in the DMZ that's being accessed by a lot of folks from my home country in Russia. So that's kind of the risk. And then lastly, helping kind of critical stakeholders in privacy, in security, in risk, understand whether they're actually meeting some of the compliance requirements around the regulations that we talked about earlier, or some of the consent requirements in terms of what you agree to. So the simple way to kind of look at this in terms of what's missing is, where's my information? Where's my information going? How vulnerable is my information? And is my information compliant with the rules that that I'm subject to? So how do we do this at BigID? So BigID is really kind of a big data company. Maybe not surprising. That's the origin of the big. And obviously we're focused on identity data. So there you go. Now you know how we came up with the name. And we basically look at a couple types of data. So we look at primary data sources like Hadoop, Mongo, relational, NFS, things of that sort. But then we also look at secondary data sources. So we look at things like logs, ELSE, Splunk, DAMs, database activity monitoring tools. We'll even consume other DLP tools and their findings. And the purpose of that is really to get a 3D picture of the data. We want to know as much about the data as we can, where it is, how it's moving, all that kind of stuff. And from there, we kind of solve for three things. We solve for an identity graph, that may sound familiar, Facebook, social graph, very similar. But again, understanding where that data is, where it's situated, but also who it belongs to, which is critical to meet the privacy regulations. Understanding other attributes around the data, like when was it accessed? Who was accessing it? So again, you can start building out a sense of flow, a sense of direction around the data. And then lastly, collecting all these other attributes. Is the data encrypted? Is the data in Russia? Is the data being accessed by a bunch of external applications anonymously? So that you can start defining all the key things to build out a risk score or a vulnerability score. We'll come back to that in a bit. And then lastly, again, provide the tools for all the critical stakeholders. That could be privacy, that could be security, that could be risk, that could be the chief data office. So they're all working off the same hymn book. And believe it or not, that doesn't happen today. Today, the chief privacy officer, typically a lawyer, sends an email request to security and says, can you do this? They don't really know what security has or hasn't done. And then compliance and risk come in once a year and say, you know what, I think this was done. I'm not sure if this was done. But that no longer is good enough. Again, with the new penalties and the new rules, you need to do a better job. Secondly, being able to kind of collaborate on investigations. And that's not just investigations internally, but also with regulators. One of the complaints we've heard from the regulators we've spoken with is they ask for information from the customer and they don't, they get a few spreadsheets. They want a more consistent and reliable way of getting the data that they need. And then lastly, again, being able to test against consent, so that's the stuff that you agree to, and also test against regulation. So even if a new version of Privacy Shield gets passed in a year, you want to figure out if that's going to impact you in advance. So those are some of the things we solve for. So in terms of the usability, what you get is essentially a command console, a SOC for privacy professionals, right? So people worried about privacy. So this gives you kind of a skin that it's not 100% implemented. But the idea here is that whether you're in the security department, whether you're in the privacy department, whether you're in the chief data office, or whether you're in the risk and compliance organization, there's a single consistent view of your customer data. And if you think about it, the most important asset an organization has is actually their customers. And that's represented their customer data. When you go to a bank today, you're not loyal to that bank because you have a relationship with the bank manager. I'm guessing most of you have never met the bank manager at most of your banks. It's really about the trust you have with their online app or so forth. And again, if that data gets compromised or impacted, you're going away. So all these guys we talk about need to have better intelligence and visibility around their customer information. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of what we do before the time completely runs out, and I'll leave a bit of time for Q&A. So we take, and this is all kind of patent pending, so we have patent filings for all this stuff. But essentially we take a very different approach to finding information. And really what you want to kind of ask is, where is my data? Because again, you can't protect what you don't know about. And so we start off with actually things you do know about. Most organizations have a sense of where some of their data is, and we basically build on that to essentially look for other examples of it. And then we essentially use kind of some algorithms to figure out additional examples of personal data. So part of our goal here is not only to find other duplicates of data, but again, it's to build that tree, that graph of your information, but it's also to find that dark data, that data that's in an organization that they may have forgotten about it, maybe it's in a backup, maybe it's somewhere else, but they want to know about it because, again, you can't protect what you don't know about. Data mapping, again, here's kind of an early screen of some of the data mapping. This kind of outlines the key things that you want to be able to speak to. You need to answer questions about who's accessing that data. Every organization needs to know that. You need to know that before and certainly after an event. You need to know how that data is moved around an organization. As I highlighted, the way this is done today is a way kind of our ancient forefathers would have been completely comfortable with. There's room for automation. Retention analysis. One of the strategies most companies want to adopt is don't keep things you don't need. So if data is there and it's sensitive and it's never getting accessed, get rid of it. Unless there's a regulatory reason why you need to keep it, like in healthcare, but you should get rid of it. But again, that intelligence around the information is not easily extracted and something we solve for. And the last thing, again, is breach impact. I think a lot of companies are now realizing that they need to be better prepared in the event of a breach. It's no longer a question of stopping every zero-day attack. It'll happen. But unless you're smart about the data, unless you have some governance infrastructure around your customer and employee data, you can't resolve and reconcile some of the breach requirements, like notifying, being able to do the forensics, etc. The vulnerability, basically, again, you've seen examples of people using risk scoring in other areas that were historically more kind of paper-based. So you've seen companies, one here in New York with a security scorecard, BitSight do it with vendor management. So essentially they're trying to give you a quantified score around how risky your partners are, so that again, you could take some precautions, you could take some steps. People have done this in the web space with vulnerability assessment tools like Qualys, but it hasn't been applied to the most critical asset in an organization, which is your customer data. And so again, we're taking all these attributes, that 3D picture we've collected, and kind of building on that so that we can develop a score for organizations. Now, we're not a dictatorial company. We live in the US, I'm Canadian. We believe in democracy, so we realize that our score is not going to be the right score for everybody. So we allow organizations to adjust the score, to adjust the weights, to create multiple versions of scores. So for instance, Forrester is developing a privacy risk score. NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is developing a privacy risk score. So what we care about is organizations being smart about their customer data, and so we'll provide them the tools to get smarter about it. And the last thing, as I mentioned, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I think it's important for a lot of these organizations to be able to easily assess whether they're on the right side or the wrong side of the law. And obviously the difficulty is that the laws seem to be changing on an almost daily basis. What's interesting about privacy is it's one of the few things legislators all agree on. Recently there was a passage in the House in the US of a new encryption bill around email. It had unanimous passage. So again, this is just an example of the fact that when it comes to privacy, Republicans and Democrats all get along. And so because of that, you see more and more organizations, more and more agencies kind of dipping their toes into the water here. And I think because of that, it's becoming more complicated for organizations to monitor their compliance. And this provides them a way to better do that. And also, I haven't really talked about consent, but I'm not going to. And that's kind of it. I think just to wrap up, we're kind of trailblazing in a new category. Again, we just started earlier this year. Software is all getting developed in Israel. We're just starting pilots, in fact, next week. We just got our first write-up in Gartner, which is nice. But yeah, I think the opportunity for us is really about kind of defining this new category around enterprise privacy management, an area that for the most part is being neglected by the traditional security vendors. That's it. Any questions? Got 3 minutes. We've got to kill 3 minutes. No? Oh, yes. Yes, sir.
Who's your competition in the space?
So I think the closest tools to us, and we kind of view them as more kind of partners in competition, is probably the DLP vendors, because they historically, they weren't designed for discovery. They were designed for other purposes. Literally an interdiction tool, so making sure you didn't send an email across your organizational perimeter. But they were really a failure there, and so they're being used as discovery tools, but not very happily by a lot of organizations. So they don't do mapping, they don't do identity graphing, they don't do a lot of things. But we like to see ourselves as the evolution of that. So if you're familiar with the user behavior analytics space, and if you look at that as kind of an evolution of the SIM space, we kind of see ourselves as an evolution, a natural evolution of the DLP space. But again, tackling a much bigger market, which is the market for privacy, which pretty much any company about to go public or any regulated organization will need to deal with.
Did you say you're a CASB?
No, we're not a CASB. So we actually work with CASBs. My partner used to be a special advisor to CloudBlock, which recently sold to Cisco. When we were at CA, we looked at acquisitions in the space. So we know the space quite well. We partner with them, Sky Hives, others, but we're not a CASB. CASB is really just focused on cloud exclusively. The reality for us is that organizations need to deal with customer information that's spread out and it's kind of sprawled across their organization. That means their data centers everywhere. I just had a call with a large web scale company on the way in here, and even they use their own data center as well as AWS, as well as Azure. So the reality is your customer information is not in one place. The problem is you don't always know where it is. Yes?
You talked about it earlier. How is Privacy Shield going to connect with the same?
So I think my partner is probably a lot more kind of. I think with all of these new rules, and I think Privacy Shield is probably going to get challenged immediately. I think the reality is that you just have to have a quantitative way of assessing what data is actually flowing and be able to prove that you have an understanding of it. In fact, the web scale company I was mentioning, I had we were talking about that very specific thing. And the reality is with a lot of these, the rules are going to change. But having a deep understanding and ability to prove, so if you look at kind of the prior regulation, it was an attestation. You said, I don't think we're using this data. And they said, that's terrific. But part of our strategy is to go to the regulators and say, you know what, there is a better way. So you don't have to trust them. You can actually, get them to use our tool and have evidence or proof that they are doing what they're claiming to do. And so, I think the kind of the details of the rule, again, my partner and some of the team and some of our kind of privacy counsel are probably a lot more intelligent about it. The way I look at it is that you're going to see an unending kind of landscape of new privacy regulations. and you can't kind of stop everything every time something gets passed. You need something that's in place, that's constantly kind of monitoring your infrastructure, so that when you want to be able to analyze or interrogate it, you get the answers you want. 5 seconds. 6. Oh, sorry, that's going the other way. We're on the other side of the Big Bang now. Okay, that's it. Thank you.